Hello, this is Michael from Being Libertarian. Today we have with us Tom DiLorenzo. Tom is the author of The Real Lincoln, How Capitalism Saved America, and most recently, The Problem With Socialism. He's the professor of economics at Loyola University in Maryland. He identifies an adherent of the Austrian School of Economics and is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. How are you doing today, Tom?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks for coming on. So, The Problem With Socialism is the new publishing. So recently, obviously, we've had the popularity of people like Bernie Sanders coming out and getting millennials all riled up about socialism. I read that in a survey recently, 46% of millennials had positive views of capitalism, while 47% had negative views. In regards to socialism, 49% of young people had positive views and just 43% had negative views. Is this just the way that people progress as they grow older politically? If you're young and conservative, you have no heart, but if you're old and Democrat, you have no head, or is there something deeper going on?
No, I think there's something deeper going on, which is why I wrote the book. I think we have the first PC generation in the college age now, and they've had several decades of the sort of constant, never-ending demonization of business and markets and business people and capitalism. And at the same time, they're preached socialism from kindergarten on in various ways, even to the extent that when the kids are in elementary school, they're taught that everybody gets a trophy, for a sporting event, even the losers. And everyone should have self-esteem, even if you never did anything to deserve the high self-esteem. And so they were thoroughly ingrained in socialistic and collectivist ideas, combined with the demonization of capitalism. And so by the time they get to be 17, 18, 19 years old, it's very easy for demagogues like Bernie Sanders to corral them into being followers of socialism, which they know nothing about.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I'm a millennial as well, so I was a part of the participation prize generation, and just a short 4 years ago, I actually thought Barack Obama was the right direction for America. So I think there is still hope that young people can go out, maybe hear some Ron Paul and read some Mises, some Rothbard, and get some good economic background. Of course, Thomas Sowell would be another great economist. He said socialism in general has a record of failure so blatant that only an intellectual could ignore or evade it. When I hear young people talking about bringing socialism to America, they seem to fail to realize that America, in its earliest pioneering days, actually experimented with socialism, which you discuss in Chapter 2, aptly titled, Why Socialism is Always and Everywhere an Economic Disaster. Can you describe what socialist policies these earliest settlers implemented and how they escaped from it?
Well, yeah, I use that as an example of the incentive effect of socialism. The American Pilgrims adopted agricultural socialism, where it was actually imposed on them by the Mayflower Company and the Jamestown Expedition, which came first. And the way they did it was that whatever anybody produced, mostly agricultural goods, would go into a common store, and then they would pay back what they owed the Mayflower Company or the Jamestown Expedition. And then they would divide equally among every family, whatever was left. And so they set up a system of where if you worked extremely hard all day long, you got paid the same as someone who did not work at all day long. And so they soon found that people got tired of being made chumps, and they didn't want to work. And they had a starvation crisis, and about 3/4 of the original Pilgrims starved to death. And so thankfully they figured it out. They figured out that this was the problem, and they changed everything around. They gave each family their own plot, and the incentive was reversed. They said, pay us back what you owe us, and then each family can keep whatever they can grow on their plot of land. And so everyone went to work at that point, and the Pilgrims thrived, and of course the rest is history. That was the beginning of the American economy.
That's great. Yeah, and it's really just foundations and free trade that really brought all the prosperity that we've seen in just the past couple hundred years. So going back to the participation prize generation, you mentioned that to disregard the inherent nature of our how all man is just inherently unequal. I love playing basketball, but I will never be a LeBron James, right? Because I'm just not that tall, I'm not that fast, I'm not that agile. fragile. But when most young people think of this inherent reality, what they think is that socialism will somehow correct this unequal nature and make us all more equal. So we obviously know that this is fallacy. This is fallacy laden. If you actually care about the poor or the sick, why should we be in favor of free trade and capitalism over government mandates of healthcare or a social welfare state?
Well, socialism inevitably makes everything worse. Well, you mentioned the welfare state. Look at the horrific results of the American welfare state. And look at any inner city in any big city in America with the masses on welfare. They live in hellholes called public housing. Their work ethic has been destroyed because they're paid welfare payments. Family breakup is rampant. There are 400% more out-of-wedlock births today than there were in 1960 in America, because fathers are off the hook. They don't have to worry. They don't have the stigma anymore of abandoning their children because the government will at least take basic care of them. And, I point out in the book that Karl Marx, one of his many false predictions in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, was that under capitalism, the working class would have just a subsistence level of living. The capitalists would pay them just enough to keep them alive and coming back to the factories. That, of course, turned out to be, grossly untrue, but it is true about people on welfare. If you want to see who lives at subsistence level for generations, it's the welfare class. And so that's just one reason why you shouldn't be in favor of more welfare. You should be in favor of more economic freedom instead.
Absolutely, absolutely. So many of the worst regimes of the 20th century outwardly identified as socialists or communists, and as you mentioned over again in your book, they placed the crushing of capitalism on their planks of their platforms of how to achieve success, Hitler or the Communist Manifesto. How did these steps help these evil men attain so much power through, regulation of industry, nationalization of resources? How did these steps help them?
In the book I point out, the Nazis were called National Socialism, is what Nazi stands for. And the Nazis nationalized about 50%, about half of their economy. And then the other half was so heavily regulated and regimented and controlled by government that it was de facto nationalized. And so they called themselves National Socialists to distinguish themselves from the Russian socialists who called themselves International Socialists. That was the main difference, but they were all the same gang. And they were very explicit about condemning classical liberalism. And if your listeners want to know what that is, look up the online book, Liberalism by Ludwig von Mises. It explains the tenets of the age-old, centuries-old ideas about freedom, free trade, peace, the rule of law, and all the elements of what we call classical liberalism, not American liberalism, but classical liberalism. And I quoted in my book Mussolini himself as condemning classical liberalism and condemning the free market economics of Adam Smith. He sort of sneered at the British way of doing things, by which he meant the writings of the British economists who were in favor of free markets and free trade. So they knew who the enemy was. It only took them about 20 years to criticize the ideas of freedom and lay the groundwork for fascism.
When I think of another contest that young people have with supposedly unfettered capitalism is they're just going to pollute the heck out of the environment, right? In your book, you say that most environmentally protected countries are the ones that actually protect private property rights, while the more polluted environments are the ones who socialize their resources. And again, most young people think it's the complete opposite. Why does capitalism actually offer better environmental protection than a socialized economy?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. Capitalism, one of the requirements of capitalism is private property, a private property society. And when you own property, along with it comes liability. That is, you're liable for how you use that property. I can own my automobile, but I have a right to do that, but I don't have a right to run you over with it. And the same can be true or should be true with pollution. I have a right to run a factory, but I don't have a right to cause you lung disease with pollution from the factory. And so with a proper liability law system, which we used to have in America, capitalism, doesn't need to be the source of pollution like that. And of course, as people become wealthier in societies, they tend to, once they have food, clothing, and shelter, they also tend to want clean air and clean water. And so we tend to see all over the world, the more capitalistic and the more prosperous countries are, the cleaner they are. Wealthier is always healthier. And also some of the worst environmental catastrophes in history are in all the socialist countries of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Today, Brazil is a horrible mess. Venezuela is a horrible mess, ecologically speaking. And these are socialist countries. These are democratic socialist countries. And you might have read during the Olympics in Brazil, they said that the water where they ran some of the Olympic competition, where swimming competition, had virus levels that were about 1 million times higher than the acceptable levels in the United States. And so socialism has created the worst pollution in world history.
Yes, and also I've heard if we actually care about protecting the ocean, protecting the environment, we should be trying to privatize these resources, because once they're in the hands of private producers, they're more likely to care if somebody spills something in the ocean, if a BP oil rig breaks, right?
Well, right, for sure. Private property, like I said, you're responsible for your property. That means if you damage somebody with it, you should be made to pay. And at the same time, look at the difference, for example, between how people who own homes treat the houses versus renters. Everybody knows that renters don't take nearly as good a care of property as homeowners do. Or compare public housing to private housing. Yeah. Public housing is dilapidated, run down, and falling apart. It's because when you own something, like property, and you take care of it, then you are the owner. If you want to sell it in the future, you get a higher price. But if you don't own it, it doesn't matter. And so you tend to despoil the property more when you don't own it.
Again, going back to the young people's infatuation with socialism, the way I think of Ron Paul is he really ignited the love of freedom and liberty in a lot of young people's hearts and told them to go out and read these several hundred-page economic treatises. And, we're starting to see the seeds that he planted actually take shape in the American political scene. We're seeing young people get involved. On the other end of that spectrum, do you think we'll see people who, because of Bernie Sanders, are fully in belief that they know enough about economics to go up there and centrally plan the economy? Do you think we'll start seeing more democratic socialists from the millennial generation run for office?
Well, I hope not. I think that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book, and others are making similar efforts. It's an easy to understand but well documented with hundreds of footnotes book, The Problem With Socialism. But I think a lot of the millennial generation who were attracted to Ron Paul were understood that the crony capitalist was rotten. I mean, the bailouts, the government bailouts of the big Wall Street banks and so forth, that's really a corrupt, rotten system. And so a lot of them, like you said, started reading up on it and reading free market economics, reading about the Austrian school and Ron Paul's books themselves, and learned a lot about it. But I think a lot of these same young people who went over when Ron Paul retired became Bernie Sanders supporters because they still resented the crony capitalists and the bailouts, but they didn't educate themselves. They didn't educate themselves on a good alternative. And they're falling for politicians offering them something for nothing, playing Santa Claus. And of course, there's no such thing as something for nothing. There's no such thing as free education or free health care. Somebody has to pay for all those universities and all those professors and all those doctors. And so I think a lot of the young people are the same people, but they never took the time to really educate themselves, and that's why I made this first effort to write a book that is easily readable to all of them, and hopefully it'll influence some of the millennial generation.
That's great. That's great. So another factor that you already mentioned is that this has kind of been ingrained into our generation since birth. And I went to a public high school, And after reading up on history, after I got into Ron Paul and Tom Woods and your writings, I learned again that everything I'd been told about American history is nearly completely backwards, that Rockefeller was an exploiter and FDR saved us from the Great Depression. Obviously, this historical revisionism plays into shaping some of these young people's views, but can you explain that Rockefeller wasn't actually somebody who raised prices, but what did he actually do to help out humans, to actually help out our country?
Yeah, that's what a monopolist does, is raise prices. And of course, what Rockefeller did, he started his company, Standard Oil Company, in 1866, the year after the end of the Civil War. And basically, what he did is he reduced the price of refined petroleum, kerosene, gasoline, and invented hundreds of new products. He reduced the price of refined petroleum year after year for about 60 years, and the cost of production of it also. And that's how he made his money. And that's how all the great entrepreneurs of the late 19th century made their money. They created efficient and very productive organizations that produced things cheaper and cheaper for decades at a time. Robert Fulton, who was credited with pioneering the steamboat business. Well, he actually had a monopoly in the steamboat business given to him by the state of New York. But Cornelius Vanderbilt, before he became a railroad entrepreneur, went in there and he was managing a competitive and illegal steamboat company. And he made money by offering free, zero-price service, and he made his money by selling food and drinks on the boats. And he drove Robert Fulton into bankruptcy. And so even Vanderbilt, got his start by producing things cheaper and cheaper for the masses. And that's what Rockefeller did, and that's what all the so-called robber barons did in the late 19th century.
So you mentioned that there's, obviously you weren't the first to mention this, but one of the fundamental problems with socialism is there's no way to accurately calculate prices. Why is this?
Well, all you have to do is look at current-day Venezuela, where the government just mandates prices. The government wanted to make itself popular by mandating low prices of things. And so the prices generally on a market will reflect relative scarcity, supply, and also the intensity of consumer demand. And it gives us signals. When people want something and a product that catches on, and they demand it, they want it, they drive the price up, and that gives producers a signal that they should produce more of it. And at the same time, when things become more scarce for whatever reason, that causes the price to go up too on the supply side, and that tells us we ought to conserve. We ought to cut back, don't consume as much. Gas is more expensive or whatever. So prices are kind of like road signs in a city, and operating an economy without market prices is kind of like trying to navigate your way around a strange city without street signs. And so without these prices, there's no way of making rational economic calculations in any way. You just everything's random, and so that's a big part of the problem. And so in Venezuela today, they have total utter chaos. They destroyed their economy with socialism in about 15 years, and middle class people who used to have good jobs are literally rooting through garbage in the streets looking for food to eat. While at the same time, the wealthiest person in Venezuela is the 35-year-old daughter of the late Hugo Chavez, who's reportedly worth $4.2 billion with a B. So socialism, by not using market prices, ruins an economy, and it creates grotesque inequality at the same time.
Yeah, I think they also have a really terrible race car driver that they kind of use as the poster child for their country doing all right, and he's frequently just crashing into the wall.
Yeah, I had an email about him from a person in Venezuela. I think he said the best he's ever done is tied for 16th or something like that. But he's some sort of, I guess he's a good-looking guy, and he's sort of a favorite. It's sort of reminiscent of how Hitler put his athletes out in the Berlin Olympics in the 1930s, trying to say that we're some kind of master race. Look at our great athletes. And so the Venezuelans have this guy that they throw out there. That's supposed to make up for their their horrible mess that they've created in their country.
You talk a lot in your book about regulations and how they constrict industry. I think when I think of the regulation that probably has the most perverse effects on the American economy, it would have to be the regulation of interest rates. And obviously, this would even go towards, Bernie Sanders supporters. They can't shut up about wealth inequality. Can you describe how artificially suppressed interest rates via the government, via the Federal Reserve, are having detrimental impacts on the economy, probably in ways that Bernie Sanders supporters think is happening, but they don't understand that it's not because of free trade, it's because of the complete opposite.
Yeah, it's our version of central planning. Well, I call it a war on the elderly, because retired people in the past who saved money for their entire working lives, and they hope to retire and make at least 5% on their money. But where can you get that now without taking on a lot of risk? You can't, because the Fed artificially lowers interest rates. Any bank that you see in the newspaper advertising, 1.25% interest, and then after inflation and taxes, you're getting a negative interest rate. And so they're really punishing the retired people of the country. And at the same time, these super low interest rates cause boom and bust cycles in the economy. For example, the real estate developers are doing in a lot of cities now what they did during the boom that ended up in a bust in '08, is that they're being able to borrow money at near zero interest rates, and they're building and building and building, and there will never be enough business for all the building that's going on. So there will be another crash. A friend of mine who lives in Las Vegas tells me that, and was a commercial lender for many years in Las Vegas, tells me that the real estate prices there are higher than they were at the peak of the bubble in '08. And so we're looking at another possible crash. And then there will be a bailout. The same banksters will be bailed out by the Fed and by the U.S. government. And the Bernie Sanders supporters will complain about that. And they'll blame it on capitalism, when in reality it should be blamed on the Fed.
Exactly. Did you see the movie The Big Short?
Yes, I did.
I just noticed in the very end of that, when they've been betting against the housing market for so long, and they realize it all comes tumbling down, one of the protagonists celebrates it as the death of capitalism. So you're getting these mixed signals from everywhere, from every direction. So last question for you. Obviously, interest rates, the Fed had them scrunched down to near zero for, I think, 8 years. They raised them 0.25 percentage point in December. And now every time they get together, they're saying that the data might be right for a rate hike. If you listen to people like Peter Schiff, he's saying there's a snowball's chance in hell for a rate hike. What's your take on that? What's the Fed's next move?
Oh, they're not going to do that before the election. The chairman of the Fed wants to be reappointed, and she's hoping that Hillary Clinton will win. Her friend Hillary Clinton will win the election. So there's not a snowball's chance in hell. I don't think that Janet Yellen will do anything to raise any interest rate that she has any influence over before the election. I would be astounded if she did.
Yeah, that's right. I think Hillary also, she got an endorsement from the Communist Party of America, didn't she?
Yes, she did, and she hasn't renounced them. I've been waiting for her to renounce support of the Communist Party. And, she was interviewed by Chris Matthews about 2 months ago, and he asked her, is there a difference between a Democrat and a socialist? And she refused to answer twice. He asked her twice, and she refused to answer. And a lot of people took that as meaning, well, she probably thinks there is no difference, really. And that's how I took it anyway.
Yeah,
she had a chance to say no, and she didn't.
Yeah, who knows if she even would care if she knew. So thank you so much for coming on today, Tom. Again, the new book is The Problem With Socialism. Please, every millennial, get this in your hands and read this book. Tom, thank you for coming on today.
So thank you for having me on the show. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. This is Michael with Being Libertarian. Thank you for tuning in.